Hey, what's up everybody? It's Izzy from PowerliftingToWin.com, and in today's program review we're going to be taking a look at Paul Carter's base building method. However, before we do that, there are a few things that I want to clear up with regards to the programming series. So due to a lack of clarity and emphasis on my part, I think a lot of people are getting the wrong idea about these reviews. Look, I'm not proceeding from a place of this program works versus this program doesn't work. I'm not proceeding from a place of this is a good program versus this is a bad program. Remember, if you watched those 3 foundational videos, which I think many of you guys skipped, so go back and check those out if you haven't already, we're proceeding from a place of good, better, best. The reality is that most of these programs work and work fairly well. In fact, if you look at the history of powerlifting, there are world champions that have used pretty much every system in existence. So you can't just point to the success of any one athlete and say, look, this is the best methodology. Because frankly, you can look at any methodology and it's pretty much produced at least one high-level elite world champion lifter. So what this programming series really aims to do is help the people who are interested in the finer details of programming really sink their teeth into the optimization puzzle. It's about the people who want to learn the minutia and how to separate the little details that make a small difference in the long run. But keep in mind, it is a small difference. So if you're looking for a way to get a small advantage on the competition, messing with your program and trying to optimize it is one place to do that. Now, do I really believe that choosing between, say, 531, Shako, and Westside is going to make a huge difference for the average trainee that just wants to get stronger and look good at the beach? No, I don't think that. I think that's pretty ridiculous. But for those of you out there who do have high competitive aspirations, for those of you out there who are willing to do anything to get a small advantage over the opposition, this is the exact type of stuff that you need to be worrying about and need to be thinking about. But the bottom line is that what program you do is not going to be the key element. It's not going to be the key foundation behind whether or not you become a great lifter. Look, if I had the opportunity to work with a guy like Michael Jordan, I could put him on the most retarded program you can imagine, and he would still dominate the opposition. Why? Because he'd still be Michael Jordan. He'd still have all those intangibles, the killer instincts, clutch performances, work ethic, belief, confidence, and all the other sports cliches that you can think of. So if you want to be a champion, if you want to be great, don't get the idea that you're going to switch to a new program and then all of a sudden you're going to get 50% more gains. It doesn't work like that. You can't just change a few variables here and there and get a huge boost on your performance. The point of this programming series is, again, good versus better versus best. We're talking about small differences in performance in the long run here. Something like 5 to 10% at the very most if you go from a good to a great program. And while that's a really significant difference in performance, it only is going to matter when you're trying to separate the guy who got third from the guy who got first. It's not going to separate the guys who are in the top 10 from the guys in the top 1,000, okay? That's a whole different discussion, and you can't make that leap just from your program. Your program really isn't that important in the grand scheme of things, because like we've already pointed out, there are athletes of every influence in terms of methodology who have become champions. So if you want to become a champion, you have to focus and obsess on all the details, not just programming details. Now, with that said, why don't we actually go ahead and review Paul Carter's base building method. So as this programming series heads towards wrap up and we look at these last half a dozen methodologies or so, the next one, as I've said, that we're going to focus on is Paul Carter's base building method. Now, base building is about an 80-page book, and it's really less of a cookie cutter template or program that you can just plug and play and copy and paste on a spreadsheet. And it's more of Paul Carter's overall programmatic philosophy and toolkit. You're going to have to go through the book and sort of put the pieces together yourself in order to turn it into a coherent program to follow. So in reality, base building is more of a system. Now, as far as the base building book goes, it's about, like I said, 80 pages long, and I'll go ahead and put a link to this in the description box for you guys. It's about 80 pages long, and again, it emphasizes Carter's overall programming philosophy. So you're going to get a lot of advice on both the micro and macro perspective. So in terms of the micro perspective, what types of programming to use, different periodization plans, how to peak, what to do in the off season, that sort of a thing. But you also get a lot of what I would call macro perspective advice. So how you should think of training for the long haul, when you should take time off, when you should individualize your program, what you should focus on that actually matters versus the things that are sort of superfluous. That said, while I'm a pretty big fan of some of Paul Carter's ideas on how you should think about progress and how you should approach lifting psychologically in general, a lot of his specific programming recommendations run counter to my personal biases in terms of what I believe to be optimal. In the rest of this review, we're going to be looking at the strengths and weaknesses of the base building system, because like I said, there is no one program that you can take from the book. So as always, we're going to start off with a little bit of context about the base building method and its author, Paul Carter. Now, unfortunately, I am not a longtime reader of Paul Carter, and I have not read all of his books. So I cannot give you a comprehensive, detailed, background on him as a lifter and his personal history. What I can tell you is that Paul Carter is not strictly a powerlifter. In fact, he's sort of risen to prominence more so through his personality and talking about a lot of topics that don't necessarily have to do with lifting. If you read through his blog, liftrunbang.com, and I'll put a link to that in the description box, what you'll see is that he includes a lot of philosophization on what does it really mean to be strong, what does it mean to be a real man, and things like that. And he has some unconventional ideas. I mean, just for example, Paul Carter does not lift with a belt. Look at the name of the site, Lift, Run, Bang. So I mean, that should give you some ideas right there as to what his personal biases are. Now, none of this is a criticism against Paul, his program, his methodology, or anything like that. It's just that I think you need to know the source of information that you're consuming. So if you're a highly, intensely competitive powerlifter who's oriented towards maximal strength, and that's your priority, you need to know that the guy that you're listening to in this case doesn't necessarily feel the same way. And what that means is that he's very likely to have unconscious biases in his programming towards accomplishing other objectives besides max strength. And in my opinion, that's definitely the case with Paul's program here. But that's just my opinion. You'll have to make your own decision on that as we go through and review the rest of the program. Alright, let's take a look at the actual base building program / system / method. Carter breaks training up into 3 general phases: mass training, base building, and strength peaking. Now, the mass training phase can most aptly be thought of as a non-specific bodybuilding phase. You're literally just doing as much as you can to get bigger. The emphasis is not on the power lifts, it's on high rep ranges and getting bigger. It's really that simple. Now, the base building phase can most aptly be thought of as a developmental block, where you're doing higher volumes with shorter rests on the big 3. So you're really looking to improve your work capacity and your technique on those movements. The base building phase lays the foundation for the strength peaking phase, where you take your improved work capacity and technique through all that high volume work that you've done, and you start to transmute it into gains on your 1 rep max as you peak for a contest. So really the strength peaking phase is a specialization block. Before we get into the actual programming here, we need to talk about Carter's concept of the everyday max. So like many popular training programs of today, Carter does not encourage you to use your all-time best 1 rep max to set up your programming. The base building method is a percentage-based program, and what you're going to base those percentages off of is what Carter calls your everyday max, or your EDM. Now, similar to 5-3-1, the EDM is approximately 90% of your true 1 rep max. However, the point is not to pick a specific percentage. The point is to pick a number that you know for sure you can hit even on your crappiest day. Alright, let's analyze each period in further depth. Let's start with mass training.
You can see the mass training phase essentially entails a bodybuilding style body part split. The reps are performed in the 8 to 20 range for the most part. This period of the training is explicitly aimed at hypertrophy. Your main goal is to pick a weight that you can do for about 8 reps and just stick with that weight until you can get closer to 15 reps or so. You don't even do deadlifts or the competition style bench on the default template provided here. You only back squat every other week. Again, this period is purposely a non-specific bodybuilding oriented training block.
The base building period is broken up into 3 different phases for each and every lift. Let's go ahead and take a look at them.
The squat base building phase features relatively light loads compared to the other lifts, but you're expected to perform each lift with compensatory acceleration, also known as CAT training. In other words, no matter how much weight is on the bar, you're supposed to lift it as fast and as hard as possible throughout the entire range of motion, even during the parts that are traditionally easier at the top. You also have a time limit on the volume work. This is going to encourage improved work capacity and aid in hypertrophy. Now, as far as when to move on to the next phases, well, Carter gives the following advice. He says that you should stick with a phase until it becomes a joke, so easy that you have to up the intensity. So outside of a competitive timeline, instead of sticking to the base building phase for 6 weeks, you could theoretically stay in base building for months and months. Just note that each phase slightly reduces volume and increases overall intensity. Let's talk about bench next. The bench base building phase is a bit different. You have higher reps here and an AMRAP set at the end of each workout. Carter, among many others, including me, feels that the upper body can handle a bit more overall stress and volume than the lower body. As such, you'll notice that the prescribed work here is higher than for the other lifts, both in terms of volume and intensity. When it comes to the deadlift, there aren't necessarily phases, but there are different models based on how much you pull. You can see that for sub 500 pullers, you're going to do 5 triples at 80% each week. For 500 to 600 pullers, the overall volume is increased, but the relative intensity of each set is lowered. Finally, for 600 plus pullers, you lift on a rotation where you're not actually going heavy every week. All of this is under the theory that the more you deadlift, the less you can do it profitably. It culminates in week 3 of each deadlift cycle of you just not deadlifting at all and doing back work instead.
The last period is the strength peaking phase. Let's look.
As you can see, in this phase, the volume is slowly tapered down while intensity is slowly cranked up. This helps accommodate the lifter to heavier loads while simultaneously allowing fatigue to dissipate, ensuring a quality peak at the meet. One thing worth noting is that you pull your last heavy deadlift 2 weeks out from the meet, whereas on the squat and the bench, you're training those up until about 7 days out from the meet. Though it isn't listed here, week 6 is intended to be a complete deload on the week of the meet itself.
Now you may have noticed that I haven't given a general training organization for the base building method yet. And that's because the base building book literally offers you about a dozen different options for training splits. There's full body templates, there's split templates, and there's things in between. So if you want to do this program, you're going to have to get the book and figure out which template is most appropriate for you. With that said, I do want to show you at least one of the templates that's typical from the book. So we're going to take a look at what Paul Carter calls the traditional split.
So as you can see, this template is what the name implies. It's a traditional split, where each lift gets its own dedicated training day. Now, this is pretty typical of most of Carter's splits, and you'll find a whole lot more that look just like this in the base building method.
As I alluded to earlier, in terms of periodization, base building is really broken up into 3 periods. One is a hypertrophy focus during mass training. The second is a focus on work capacity, volume tolerance, and technique during base building. And the last one is a maximal strength peaking phase when you get ready for an actual powerlifting contest. Now, as we previously learned, this is an advanced programmatic structure that's most appropriate for late stage intermediates and advanced athletes. An early intermediate trainee simply doesn't need different periods of emphasis from mesocycle to mesocycle. They only need intelligent variation in volume and intensity from week to week, aka programming. Now, even Carter doesn't recommend that novices do this program, so I think it should go without saying that novices can improve everything simultaneously, and they should be on a program that allows them to do that. All this said, for advanced trainees, this is an intelligent way to structure programming, for the most part. Because again, advanced trainees need more volume on each quality to improve that quality. And if they were to try to improve all qualities simultaneously, the total volume would be too much to recover from. So advanced athletes greatly profit from these different periods of emphasis on different physical qualities. And as such, base building is completely appropriate for this group. In terms of programming, base building doesn't use traditional block programming per se, but it is organized into your typical phases of medium intensity, high volume, and medium volume, high intensity. So for example, during the base building phase, you're doing a lot of work on the main lifts. You're building up your work capacity, your volume tolerance, and you're improving your baseline performance, which is the whole point of the name base building. Now, during the strength peaking phase, what you're doing is essentially taking all of this work capacity that you've built up, all this volume tolerance that you've built up, all these hypertrophy gains that you've made, and you're trying to transmute them into improvements on your 1 rep max. And that's why you're going to drop the volume back so you can start to taper and set yourself up for a peak, while at the same time increasing the intensity so that you can get yourself accommodated to moving those heavier weights and perform better at the meet. The mass training phase is actually even higher volume and even lower intensity than the base building phase. So the entire programmatic structure is really like a pendulum. It swings from high volume, low intensity to low volume, high intensity in those final few weeks before the meet. And overall, this is an intelligent and appropriate way to structure programming for the vast majority of intermediate and advanced trainees, regardless of where they are in those stages. So if you're an intermediate or advanced trainee, this type of programming will work for you. Like many of the programs that we've looked at thus far, in my opinion, the biggest weakness of base building is the lack of specificity. Now, I know many of you are going to vehemently disagree with me on this, but in my opinion, it is never necessary for a powerlifter to have an explicit period where they're focusing on bodybuilding style training. It just isn't necessary. Now, the idea behind bodybuilding training is that it's better for hypertrophy than doing powerlifting style training. But why is that the case? The reason why bodybuilding training is better for hypertrophy than powerlifting training is because of the total volumes used by the two groups of athletes. The main driver of hypertrophy is total volume. A lot of people think it has to do more with rep range, but in reality, rep range is just a tool to get you to higher volumes. You have to keep in mind that intensity determines training effect and volume determines the magnitude of that training effect. If you're working in any appreciable intensity range, like say anything above 60% or so, you're going to get a significant amount of hypertrophy from getting stronger in that intensity range. Even if you're doing work at 90%, you're going to get bigger and stronger for sure. So what really separates the total hypertrophy then is, again, the magnitude. And what determines magnitude? Volume. Because bodybuilders are primarily interested in getting bigger over getting stronger, their emphasis has to be on getting as much volume done as possible. But there are realistic time constraints to how long anybody can be in the gym. I mean, you got to eat your next meal, you got to go to work, all sorts of stuff, right? So it's just more efficient, for example, to do 3 sets of 20 than it is to do 20 sets of 3. Most people are not professional athletes who have time to do that. If you were to do those two things, you'd probably get, believe it or not, comparable levels of overall hypertrophy. Now, I do think that it is important for a powerlifter to have periods of emphasis on reps in the 5, 6, 7, and 8 range, but anything above that, especially a period like Carter has on his default template where you're not deadlifting, you're not flat benching, and you're only back squatting every other week, man, you just don't need to be that non-specific in order to build useful mass for powerlifting. In fact, you can take a look at Mike Teixeira, who has a 2,100 pound raw drug-tested total in the IPF, and he never programs the main lifts really above 7 reps or so. You can also look at Boris Shako's programming, and he also, for the most part, never has his lifters doing reps above 8 on the main movements. So there's tons of successful methodologies out there that prove this is just not necessary. And again, if you're going to be doing bodybuilding style training to the point where you're not deadlifting, you're not doing flat bench, and you're only back squatting once every other week, as is the case in the default template provided by Paul Carter's mass training in the base building book, well, I just can't see how that's possibly specific enough to maximize your gains. There's just no need for this bodybuilding style training that's so prevalent in all American powerlifting programs. And like most Americans, in my opinion, Carter has way too big of an emphasis on back work. Now, again, a lot of you guys are going to get mad and disagree with me about this, but here's the thing. While back work might be important at a minimum to keep your shoulders healthy and to keep you having good postural balance and all of that, it does not contribute as much to your total as doing more deadlifting, benching, and squatting. It's not that doing back work is going to make you weaker, it's going to make you stronger. It's going to add to your squat, bench, and deadlift. That's right, I'm not saying back work doesn't work. I'm saying it doesn't work as well as simply using that volume to do more squats, benches, and deadlifts. If you only have enough time, energy, and recovery to train 4 times a week, in my opinion, it's completely ridiculous to dedicate a full day to training your back. And in base building, there's many templates where you train your back twice a week as a full training session. It's just not necessary in my opinion. The other big criticism that I have in terms of specificity has to do with the squatting percentages that you use during the base building method. Carter has you doing a lot of squats at 60%, and this is modeled off of the training of Sam Bird and Fred Hadfield. Now, those are 2 guys that you definitely would look up to in terms of the squat, but in my opinion, doing most of your work at 60% is just not heavy enough to be specific to produce optimal powerlifting gains. Now, Carter does encourage compensatory acceleration training, which basically means that you lift the bar as hard as you can regardless of how much weight is on there. Now, that's not speed work, it's a different thing. It's just you using maximum volitional force on every rep, trying as hard as you can even if it's easy. But even when you do this, you're still not producing max force. Let's say you're capable of 500 pounds of force, right? You got a 500 pound 1 rep max. If you put 300 pounds on the bar, no matter how hard you push the bar, you're not going to be able to put 500 pounds of force on the bar because it just doesn't work that way. Your body will not recruit the same overall amount of motor units and you won't produce 500 pounds of force. So even though you're using compensatory acceleration training with Paul Carter's base building method, I just don't think that doing most of your work at 60% is heavy enough to translate into optimal gains. Now, will doing 60% work make you stronger? Of course it will. But will it make you as stronger as doing more of that work in the 80 to 90% range? Probably not. Now, the rest of the program rates fairly well in terms of specificity. Most of the volume that you do, especially during the base building and strength peaking phases, comes on the main movements and close variants of the main movements. And that's exactly how it should be in any powerlifter's program. In terms of overload, base building uses a combination of your basic progressive overload and adding reps in order for you to make progress. Throughout the different phases and different periods, the intensity is slowly ratcheted up, so over time you're handling heavier and heavier weights. There's also a variety of periods in the program where you do AMRAP sets, as many reps as possible, and getting more reps on these isn't one other way to constitute overload. However, one of the great points that Carter makes in his book is that you don't necessarily need to set a weight or rep PR in order to know that you're making progress. The example that he uses is, if you hit a triple at 500 pounds and it was a grinder, absolutely no reps left in the tank, and then you do it again a couple months later, and now it was easy, you feel like you had a good 2 reps left in the tank, you've certainly gotten stronger even though you haven't set a PR in terms of reps and weight. And really what he stumbled onto here is the concept of RPE. If you hit a triple with nothing left in the tank, that's called at 10. It's maximal effort. If you hit a triple with 2 in the tank, that would be at 8, right? 2 reps left. And that is definitely a great way to gauge progress. And the way that Carter does this in base building is that you may have noticed in the programming there's lots of singles before or sometimes after your work sets. And here's the thing, Carter calls these over warm-ups and fatigue singles. And the whole idea is that by hitting these singles, which are still higher percentage than your volume work, but still relatively easy because they're only singles, you can gauge your overall progress in the higher intensity ranges. Because if those reps are getting faster and easier over time, your max is moving up. In terms of fatigue management, my first temptation was to criticize this program for not having enough frequency. As many of you guys know, I personally believe that 1 time per week frequency is suboptimal. It's harder to recover from, you're not going to build as much muscle, and you don't get as many chances to improve your technique. However, that said, I can't really levy this criticism against base building because Carter does include several templates in the book which are full body and offer higher frequencies. Moving on, overall, I feel that the volume is a bit too low in the strength peaking phases. As you move into strength peaking from base building, you're only doing 2 or 3 work sets per week for an entire 6 weeks. And in my opinion, especially if you're doing one of his once per week templates, that's just not enough volume to drive optimal progress. Unless you're a very large athlete who is taking performance enhancing supplements, from what I've seen, most natural trainees can not only recover for more than that, but they need to do more than that in order to make continued progress. One of my biggest issues with this program in terms of fatigue management is his philosophy about deadlifting for advanced athletes. I don't personally believe that it's ever necessary to deadlift only once every 2 weeks in terms of going heavy. If you look at the programming of Boris Shako, he has his athletes deadlifting heavy 2 to 3 times per week. If you look at Mike Teixeira, another guy who is producing excellent gains for many IPF drug-tested lifters, he has his advanced athletes deadlifting twice a week many times. So in my opinion, this whole myth that the deadlift cannot be trained more frequently just isn't true. Here's the problem. A lot of people buy into this idea that you can't deadlift more often, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Remember, specificity, specificity, specificity. If you don't do a lot of deadlifting, your body is going to reduce its overall volume tolerance and its overall work capacity in response to the stimulus that you're giving it. It's just like, say, the person who says, I can't go in the sun without getting burned. So they never go into the sun, right? And then when they're forced to go into the sun once every month or something, they're much more likely to get burned. If they had slowly built that volume tolerance up over time, doing more and more work, they'd be less likely to get burned. And it's really the same thing with deadlifts. You should be looking to improve your volume tolerance and work capacity. You shouldn't be looking to cut back even more as you get advanced. Again, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you do that, you are going to reach a point where you can't recover from deadlifts anymore, except for if you do them once every 2 weeks, because that's what your body has now adapted to. And the big problem with this long term is that eventually you're going to reach a point where you need a high volume to make progress, but you haven't built your work capacity or volume tolerance over the years, so you just literally can't do the volume that you need to make progress because it will result in overtraining. And this is the trap that I feel like a lot of guys get caught up in on the deadlift. So in my opinion, it's highly suboptimal to only be deadlifting once every 2 weeks in terms of going heavy. Remember, if you don't use it, you lose it. These criticisms aside, overall, the structure of the fatigue management on this program is sound. As long as you're one of those people who can make progress on low volume, low frequency programs like this, you're not going to run into any recovery issues with base building. Unlike, say, Shako, this program or method or system errs on the side of doing too little versus doing too much. And for most lifters who can make progress on low volume, low frequency templates, this is going to work out great for them. In terms of individual differences, I feel like Carter's base building does a great job from the macro perspective, but mostly fails from the micro perspective. Let me explain what I mean by that. In terms of the macro perspective, overall philosophy about training stuff, Carter's does great. I mean, he encourages that you individualize your program over time. He says that you need to be aware of when to switch from different periods of emphasis to another. He has all sorts of different tips and tricks in order for you to customize and individualize your programming for your body. And that's great. This is the long, big picture stuff that ultimately matters quite a bit in your long-term progress. However, from the micro perspective, session to session and week to week, the only auto-regulation that's present in this program is the ability to work up to your everyday max on days when you feel great. So in other words, the training loads that you're using are pretty much fixed, and even though there are some AMRAP sets in there, your overall volume is pretty much fixed for the most part as well. Now, here's why I think a lot of these programs use these training maxes. It's their attempt to account for fluctuations in readiness and performance given an individual trainee who's going to have different crap happen to him in his life that changes how he does on any given day. So for example, by forcing you to use 90% of your true max, if you do have that day where you get hit by a bus, you can still go in and hit all of your weights even on just the crappiest day ever because of how light that they are. So instead of creating a system where you can take advantage of what you're capable of on that day, they create a system where you program so light that even the worst day is still doable. Now, while this is great because it always keeps you moving forward, I feel like it diminishes the quality of your average and great days because you can't really take advantage of them as well. Now, this is why I prefer Mike Teixeira's RPE system, because you can use RPEs to get into the exact intensity zone that you want to be in. We know that if we do 5 reps and it feels like we have 1 left in the tank, we're working in about 85%. Now, if we take 100% of our max and then take 10% off of that and then multiply that by 85%, well, now on an average day, what we have is about like 75%. On a crappy day, it's 85%. And on a great day, it's 65%. So you still can manage all of that, right? You're not gonna fail, but you're not gonna take advantage in the same way. You're not gonna be able to use the same loads. You're not gonna be able to get into the exact intensity zone that you want. Your intensity is gonna be all over the place. And you won't fail, but at the same time, you're not getting into the zones that you want to be in. And again, on volume, as you guys have heard me say a million times at this point, you can tell someone to do 5x5 at 75%, but you have no idea what effect that's actually having on them. For a 50-year-old trainee, 5x5 at 75% might cripple them for 2 weeks. For a 19-year-old on a seafood diet doing GOMAD with whole milk, he's going to be ready to go in 48 to 72 hours. It's not going to matter. So just giving somebody a volume prescription doesn't tell us their response to that prescription. You're just hoping and wishing at the effect. And again, everybody needs different volume, even from session to session. If you got a lot of sleep and you're eating well, you can do more volume. You need to do more volume to take advantage of it. If you slept for 2 hours last night and you ate 1,000 calories yesterday, you should not be doing as much volume because you won't be able to, for one, and 2, it's just gonna put you into a deep recovery debt. So there has to be some regulation of volume present in order for a program to be optimal, especially for intermediate and advanced athletes. Look, I don't want these reviews to come across as overly critical. I'm not trying to shit on people to stir up controversy here. I don't want you guys to take this as me saying, look, base building works or base building doesn't work. I think that base building is a novel and original work, and I think that means a lot considering that I've read now 2 or 3 dozen of these little programming ebooks in the last few weeks. Carter has created a method that's all his own, and I applaud his creativity. I think base building is rock solid. That said, as a reviewer, in order for me to be intellectually honest, I have to point out aspects of the program that I personally feel are suboptimal. And I've always given my reasoning for why I feel that way. So again, when I point out what I perceive to be flaws in the program, it's coming from a spirit of, hey, this program could be further optimized. It is not coming from the spirit of saying, hey, this program is a piece of shit. Okay, that's not my goal here. I really don't want you guys to take this as me saying this program is good, this program is bad, this one works and this one doesn't. It's good, better, best. It's optimal versus suboptimal. That said, I really think that like most American programs, base building has too much emphasis on bodybuilding work and bodybuilding fluff throughout the program. I think there's too much emphasis on training your back, and I don't think there's enough frequency on most of his templates. And during many phases of the program, the volume, in my opinion, is just too low to be optimal for the natural raw trainee. If you study the training of the top IPF lifters, you'll notice that most of them train between 4 to 6 times a week with medium to high volume templates. And again, that's not evidence, it's just a fact that I'm pointing out. Go ahead and look at their training methods and see for yourself. In conclusion, base building deserves a solid overall rating. But in my opinion, as raw powerlifters, there are more optimal options out there for you guys. Due to popular demand, the next program we're going to be taking a look at is the Lilliebridge method. Now, the Lilliebridge family might be the most successful in the history of this sport. It seems like every single one of them has a world record or two. So it should be fun and interesting to take a look at their very simple, very old school, very basic Western periodization programming scheme. Hopefully it'll be instructive. If you guys found this content interesting, informative, or entertaining, please like, share, and send it out into the interwebs for me. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to pop over to the Powerlifting to Win forums and I will address any issues that you have personally. Subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget to check out PowerliftingToWin.com for more great powerlifting information. Have a nice day.